Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Kim Maphis Early with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. The Simmons Foundation sponsors this briefing, which is the 8th in our series of Hurricane Harvey recovery funder briefings. In the past, we've covered a number of topics relevant to disaster recovery and heard from funders who've made significant commitments to the rebuilding of the lives of those affected by the hurricane. We hope that these briefings have assisted you as you've guided your own organizations in funding long-term recovery. Today, we'll be focusing on urban and regional planning for recovery in the built environment, specifically on affordable housing. All these briefings have been recorded, and you can find them archived along with a written summary at the Simmons Foundation website in their initiative area on Hurricane Harvey. Our written summary report that will be there will have active links to any resources that are mentioned today in our briefing. We'll start today with some news about recovery, and then we'll hear from our guests about housing initiatives and the need for attention to low-income housing as recovery planning and rebuilding continue. Then it's your turn. As is our practice in these briefings, funders can share information about their own work and ask questions of each other. We're hosting these briefings for you and for your benefit in your strategic planning. Your participation with news and questions helps move the funding work forward. You may submit a question to our speakers or to your fellow funders at any time using the Q&A box on the top of your screen. Simply type your question and hit send. If you're interested to share the recovery work of your own foundation, click on the icon to raise your hand, and when that time comes in our briefing, I'll announce your name, and that will turn your mic on. Wait a second for the sound to kick in, and then share the name of your philanthropic organization and any news you want us to know or questions you'd like the group of funders to consider. We'll begin today with some news updates. The USDA Rural Development is hosting one-day sustainability workshops for representatives from local water and wastewater utility systems to assess their overall strengths and areas of opportunity for sustainability. You'll see here the dates of these and the work that's going to happen there. In addition, Del Mar College is doing an emergency preparedness hurricane workshop, since we know that these are coming up in the fall and we need to get ready for them. This is designed to give small businesses and other organizations the tools needed to prepare for natural disasters, including resources in the Coastal Bend area to create an emergency preparedness plan. That will be held on May the 24th in Corpus Christi. The Economic Development Administration has 4 more economic recovery workshops to be held in the area: Southeast Texas, the Golden Crescent, Coastal Bend, and the Houston-Galveston area. The fiscal year 2018 Disaster Supplemental Notice of Funding Opportunity has made $587 million available to eligible grantees in communities that have been impacted by natural disasters. And that'll be discussed at all these EDA meetings. The Texas Water Development Board administers multiple programs, including state revolving fund loans, grants, and disaster recovery dollars for repair of drinking and storm and wastewater systems. Funds are available to any local government political jurisdictions, including cities, fire districts, and municipal utility districts. Funds can be used for a local match or as a bridge loan for your CDBG, Disaster Recovery Grant. And our focus for today is on housing, and here's some news about that. Housing and Economic Assistance to Rebuild Texas, the acronym is HART, is a new program for organizations providing critical home repairs and other housing assistance to low-income Texas families. This is a partnership between Texas State Affordable Housing Corporation and Enterprise Community Partners. Grants for up to $50,000 and technical assistance have been made possible by a gift from Rebuild Texas. I'm pleased to have with us today Katrina Durbak, who's a program analyst with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in the Office of Policy Development and Research, Office for International and Philanthropic Innovation. Quite a long title there, Katrina. She's an urban and regional planning and policy expert whose career and research focuses on climate change adaptation, hazards, water, and land use. On behalf of HUD, she engages with philanthropy, civil society, and interagency partners in support of resilient communities and disaster recovery. Welcome, Katrina. And be sure to unmute your mic. There you go.
I knew I was going to forget one of those buttons. Thank you, Kim, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you to Kim and the team at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy for all their work and for organizing this call and this series of calls and briefings. And I also want to thank everyone on the call. We know that you are all doing very important work in communities around the country, and in many ways, the work you do helps inform the ongoing policy discussions here in Washington around disaster recovery. We know that philanthropy and government need to continue to work together, to push boundaries together, and to align our efforts to realize our goals of safer and stronger communities. And we know that the expertise of our philanthropic partners working with HUD across multiple administrations have helped us in the field of recovery move forward. We're very grateful for your partnership. And as Kim mentioned, we're always interested to hear about what you're doing. And I'll take a few minutes to share some updates about HUD's work on the disaster recovery efforts. And more importantly, well, perhaps not more importantly, equally as importantly, I want to share with you some ideas of opportunities for how we can align our efforts. We know we are stronger when we all communicate what we're doing and when we can think strategically about how do we leverage the money that, in this case, HUD and the federal government can put out, and the expertise and the unique abilities that all of you have, often on the ground and directly at the community level. I don't need to repeat to all of you how record-setting 2017 was for massive natural disasters across the U.S. Obviously, our focus here is on Texas and Hurricane Harvey specifically, and HUD's commitment to working with our residents and communities to rebuild in the aftermath of these disasters is a huge and ongoing effort. The slide that Kim has pulled up lets me take one step back. I know our focus here is on Texas and Hurricane Harvey recovery, but I'm putting this up partially to give you an update on some of HUD's work, and as Kim shared some of the information about what other federal agencies, including the Economic EDA, has put forward. This is also I'm sharing with you to clarify if there's any confusion, or if you're wondering if you are hearing multiple things about in the news. So the slide you see here shows additional congressional allocations that Congress has just most recently awarded to communities that have been impacted by natural disasters in 2017 and also going back to 2015. Now, this is funding that HUD awarded only last month. This came out this past April, or this April, I should say, that just passed. This is in addition to over $5 billion in disaster recovery funding that has already been awarded to Texas, specifically to focus on Hurricane Harvey recovery, as well as millions of dollars of recovery aid that have already been put out. So, not to confuse you, but this is the additional allocations on top of the $5+ billion already awarded to Texas. As you see, this is laid out by states and territories, and also by year of presidentially declared disaster. That's how these sites were selected. And you'll notice that there's a breakdown in the two columns between what we refer to as remaining 2017 disaster unmet needs and awards for mitigation. Now, I'll share with you, without going into all of the weeds, that we at HUD are in the process of developing administrative guidelines for the use of funds and for distinguishing between those two buckets of needs. But part of why I'm putting this up there is to show you that this additional allocation of funding is huge. And this represents the single largest amount of disaster recovery assistance in HUD's history. And we're looking at almost $28 billion in what was put out last month. And this is already on top of over $5 billion that Texas specifically has received. So as you may or may not be familiar, HUD's disaster recovery funds, you'll see towards the top of the screen, our acronym of choice is Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funds, or CDBGDR. I'm going to try to not use acronyms, but you may have heard that phrase, or that acronym rather. The way this money is allocated to communities, and I apologize if you're all already intimately familiar with this process, is through local governments. So HUD largely relies on both our local governments and also our communities at the local level to provide feedback to local government, to provide input in public engagement. We require our recipients, so in this case, the local government authority overseeing the funding that is going towards Hurricane Harvey recovery is the Texas General Land Office, or GLO. And so we rely very strongly on the local partners, but also, I can't stress enough, on the local community, and that includes all of you and the knowledge, expertise, and experience you have in coming to the table and in being able to share with, in this case, GLO, what you know and what you see are needs and how you can help shape how that funding is used. So I know that Texas GLO released the state action plan allocating how $5 billion of HUD recovery funds are to be used. They released that plan on April 10th, and I know they had allowed for approximately 2 weeks, I think, for public engagement. That first public engagement period has closed. Many of you may have been involved in it. We don't think that the fact that first formal public engagement period being closed, we don't see that as an end of an opportunity for public engagement, but rather one step. And so what they released with that plan was, and again, I apologize if I'm repeating things that you all know, it's a breakdown of how that over $5 billion of initial funding will be used. And reading off of their press release, that's broken down into single-family homeowner assistance, buyouts and acquisitions of properties, homeowner reimbursements, homelessness prevention, affordable rental housing, local infrastructure, economic revitalization, and local, regional, and state planning. There's a lot there. And I'm sure we can provide this press release from the GLO office of the state of Texas for their plan for that initial $5 billion in HUD recovery funding. We can provide that in the resources, as Kim mentioned at the top of the call. I do want to make sure to take a moment or two to share with you some of what we see as gaps in what HUD can fund. And rather than gaps, we see these really as opportunity areas where philanthropy works very well, where we see opportunities to help further our work, to leverage our funds, and to really allow them to have greater impact. The opportunities I'll share with you in just a moment, I've grouped into 3 categories. I'll list them and then explain them in a little more detail. And just to share with you that these opportunities have been pulled together based on consultation with my colleagues here at HUD who have years of experience and expertise on disaster recovery. Unfortunately and sadly, this is a field that is expanding and growing and in which we do have expertise and experience. I myself have worked on hurricane recovery. I was based in southern Louisiana to work on recovery from Gustav and Ike. And to share with you, our Assistant Secretary for Community Planning and Development here at HUD, who oversees all of the disaster recovery work, is a gentleman by the name of Neil Ratcliffe. Some of you may or may not be familiar with him. Neil comes to us from the city of Houston itself, where he served as the Director of Housing for the city. He served in that role from 2012 to 2016 and has over 20 years of experience in this field, but he was in Houston specifically for the Hurricane Ike recovery. And so I say that to let you know that inside HUD's walls, we may be a little bit further from you, given that we're in DC, but we understand firsthand and intimately a lot of what is going on in Texas, in Houston, and the greater metropolitan area. And we are eager to work with you and to be supportive. But now let's dive into the fun part, the opportunities for aligning and leveraging our respective strengths. So as I mentioned, I'm going to use 3 categories. And Kim, I promise I'm checking on the time and I won't run too late. So the first category I refer to as aligning and leveraging to HUD's efforts and funds. What I mean by this is a real opportunity where HUD funding can go only so far, but we know there is that gap. And what I mean by this is the basics that an individual or family needs to restart their lives, to restart their households beyond just the bricks and sticks of rebuilding the home. So this includes several elements. One piece we can refer to as the last mile challenge. And this is something that many residents face, even after their homes have been rebuilt. Perhaps they received funding from a combination of FEMA and HUD to rebuild their home, but they still need help getting their furniture or getting furniture. They may need help if they're renting, paying the first or last month's rent. They may need assistance with simply being able to put down the deposit to open an account with a utility company. Those are little things that HUD can't fund, but those are huge things to a family that's trying to get back on their feet. Similarly, I'll mention there's also the aspect of social services and wraparound services, which are critical for many families to get their lives back on track. This is an area that we see that is often funded for a short window in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, but for many individuals and families, they really rely on these services, or they need these kind of services, often for up to 2 years after a disaster. They may have figured out getting one piece of their lives, or piece A and D, on track, but the B and C still need help to get that glue together. And that's an area where we see many of our partners on the ground are well equipped to assist. And additionally, there are some people who will not qualify for HUD funding for a variety of reasons. So let me move on to the second category of opportunities. This category I refer to as local engagement, messaging, and outreach. And this can also play out in several ways. Philanthropic organizations are often very engaged at the community level and with subsets of the population that the federal government can struggle to effectively engage or keep informed. We're eager for our funds and efforts to help local residents and the places where many of you are based, including daycares, schools, community centers, and with specific subpopulations with whom you work, who are often the very people that the federal government can have difficulty reaching or informing of funding and other opportunities. In addition, under this category of local engagement, messaging, and outreach, an important role we see for philanthropy is in the role of an honest broker. We recognize that philanthropy is an honest broker and is usually respected as such by all sides. All of you are well equipped to be a connector between local residents and local governments. You understand the issues on the ground and the concerns of specific groups. This is important in several key ways. As I've already mentioned, public input and long-term public engagement is important. And this is important from both sides, I should say. Sadly, we know that there is a need for long-term planning and for creative approaches for when, not if, the next disaster hits, because we know there will be a next time. And we know that the period after a disaster is often more difficult, especially to have difficult conversations. But we know this is also a period when there are decisions made over what gets rebuilt and where and how and for whom. And difficult conversations often need someone that can fill that role of an honest broker, right? There may be conversations about buying out certain properties in high-risk areas and how that gets balanced with the concerns over not harming residents, especially who may be most vulnerable or who may have the least political voice. We also know that from the position of HUD at the federal level, we are not dictating to the local government which decisions are made. We are requiring our rules be followed, that rights are being respected, that low and moderate members of the community are not overlooked, but exactly how that plays out, exactly how the puzzle pieces are put together, really happens at the local level. And so this is where we see philanthropy having a very important role in connecting the different segments of the community, and again, in being that honest broker. And the third category of opportunities we see is in research and evaluation. This again is an area where the philanthropic community excels, and we see value in telling the story of community recovery with greater granularity. We know that there are a lot of statistics out there about the number of homes rebuilt and the amount of power that is connected. But we have less data, we have less evaluation and monitoring of how the entire community recovery effort is going and in tracking milestones across issues. This kind of research also helps us at HUD and at the federal government improve our work. The research and evaluation side of the puzzle is also an area where philanthropy can be creative and can have the ability to make long-term investments that can ultimately push the work further. So now I'm afraid I'm either up to time or maybe even ran over my time a little bit. But before I turn the microphone back over to Kim, I want to mention one more thing, and that is that we at HUD are eager to be good partners to all of you. We want to hear from you during this session and also afterwards. We want to be available to you. We periodically hold funders calls, especially as some of this information is coming out, and we're eager for you to join those. And so without further ado, I will just say, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Kim can share my contact info with all of you, and I'm happy to connect with you and connect you to the appropriate folks here at HUD. And I thank you again for all of your work.
Thanks, Katrina. We have a few questions for you that we're going to hold until the close of Sarah's presentation. And we want to welcome Sarah. She is the Senior Director of Policy for the National Low Income Housing Coalition, which is a nonprofit that educates, organizes, and advocates to ensure decent, affordable housing. Its goals are to preserve existing federally assisted homes and housing resources, expand the supply of low-income housing, and establish housing stability as the primary purpose of federal low-income housing policy. Sarah previously worked with Enterprise Community Partners as a senior analyst, and in that role, she focused on building congressional support for federal affordable housing and community development appropriations, including funding for programs administered by HUD, like we've heard about today, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure of being able to speak with all of you today. I wanted to give, before we get started into the details of some of the work we're doing and some of the issues that we're seeing on the ground, I wanted to build on that great description of our work. Thank you so much, but by also pointing out that our focus tends to be on people who have the very lowest incomes. And that's something that unites us as our mission, and our members include people who work as developers or faith-based organizations, homeless providers, across the sector to focus on people who have the greatest needs. So why have we chosen to focus more on disaster recovery? Part of that is because we know that disasters tend to hit people with the lowest incomes the hardest, and their communities the hardest. And in part that's because their communities are often chronically underfunded when it comes to infrastructure investments that would help alleviate or mitigate some of the damage caused by disasters. But also we know that low-income people and communities have the fewest resources to respond and to move towards recovery. This is, of course, exacerbated by federal policy changes where it can be very hard for the lowest income people to get their fair share of resources that they can use to rebuild their lives and their communities. So the other thing that we've noticed in our work, or what has drawn us to this work, is that disasters tend to hit areas that already have a severe shortage of affordable rental homes. So if you look across the spectrum, both in Miami and Houston, Orlando, and California, those are all areas that have already had a severe shortage of affordable housing and were most critically impacted by the affordable housing crisis before the storms even hit or wildfires even hit. So for example, Houston, Miami, and Orlando are all 3 of the top 10 metro areas with the worst housing crisis right now. And we know that after a storm, more affordable housing, especially housing for the very lowest income people, is often lost forever. So to give you a sense of what those needs are in those communities, we do an analysis here where we look at the number of affordable and available homes for every 100 extremely low income households. And we found that before the storms hit, for example, in Houston, there were only 19 homes for every 100 extremely low-income households. Similarly, in Miami, only 22 homes for every 100. In Orlando, only 17 homes. And in California, only 22. And what that means is that even prior to the storm, the other 80 or so % of extremely low-income households really had no available housing options to them that were affordable, and have had little choice but to spend at least half of their income on rent. And as a result, they are in a compromised position when a disaster hits because they have very few savings that can help stem the tide and carry them over to get back onto their feet. So earlier, several months ago, before the storms hit Houston, we reached out to our state and local partners there, as well as national groups, to pull together a disaster housing recovery coalition that would focus on the immediate but also very long-term recovery needs in those communities. And we found that it served a dual purpose in a way of both helping to alleviate some of the burden that was placed on local nonprofits to respond immediately after the disasters, but also to keep everyone on the same page at the national level and to have the problems and solutions rise from the bottom up in terms of what was happening locally and what needed to happen to change those situations. So that group now includes more than 700 local, state, and national organizations, mostly based in Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, and California, but also organizations with direct disaster recovery experience from Louisiana, Mississippi, New York, and New Jersey. And we found that this is a really great way of sharing best practices and lessons learned from previous disasters to help implement recovery this time around. The groups that are involved in our coalition also run the gamut from housing providers to legal aid organizations, fair housing groups, charitable groups, faith-based groups, federal agencies, members of Congress and their staff, housing authorities, groups that work on homelessness issues, and capital investors. So it really runs the gamut of anyone who would have a touch on housing recovery going forward. And we've looked at, I'd say, 4 main areas of where we can have the biggest impact. And the first is responding to the very immediate housing needs of survivors, including those with the lowest incomes, and then related to that, their longer-term housing needs. As many of you know, after a disaster, FEMA often places displaced households in hotels through their transitional sheltering assistance program, but there are so many barriers that the lowest income people face that prevent them from even being able to benefit from that service. So many hotels charge daily fees to live in the hotels after a disaster, or they require security deposits or credit cards, all of which serve as significant barriers to low-income people. And what we saw is that when families were unable to get into these hotels, they really had no choice but to either sleep in their car, to return to shelters, to return to homes that were uninhabitable and put them and their families at risk of injury or health issues, all of which are, or to double and triple up with other households or pay even more of their income on rent, all things that are precarious housing situations that are likely to lead or put them at an increased risk of evictions and, in worst cases, homelessness. But the other barrier has been the transition from TSA to longer-term housing solutions. In that case, we're now 8 months past the storm, and there are still 6,000 households who are still living in hotels throughout the country. These are folks who are have significant issues finding permanent housing solutions, and for which TSA is really not a good long-term solution for them, unlike a stable, affordable apartment would be. So we're working very hard to try to get resources that are targeted to those low-income households, whether it's through direct rental assistance or others that aren't currently being provided or could be provided in a better way. The second issue that we've been focusing on is how we can ensure that federal recovery resources are allocated fairly, and so that low-income people and low-income communities and communities of color are receiving their fair share of the benefits that are provided. We've seen after past disasters that money that should have been spent on the housing recovery are often instead allocated to infrastructure projects, which are always important, but not at the expense of housing needs for low-income people. And likewise, we've seen dollars that should have been provided to renters instead be diverted and provided to higher income households, mostly homeowners. And so what we've been pushing for is systematic, ongoing data transparency, both from FEMA and HUD, to better understand where the damage from the disasters had taken place, and then how dollars are spent to meet that need on as granular a level as possible to ensure that there's a correlation between the two. And likewise, along those lines for data transparency is the opportunity for public comment and public input in the disaster recovery plans that are being put forward by the different states. Our third area of focus has been on the particular needs of people who are experiencing homelessness. We know that it's often very difficult for people who are experiencing homelessness prior to a disaster to receive benefits from FEMA. We know that they're entitled to those benefits, but sometimes in practice it is very difficult to have that play out. So for example, after the storm, we saw places where homeless individuals were segregated from other households that were displaced due to the storms, or we saw challenges with them even signing up for disaster aid that they're entitled to for simple reasons like they don't have a home address to put on the FEMA application. So we've been working both in the immediate aftermath of disasters to help respond to the needs of people experiencing homelessness, but also to look forward to the next disaster and how we can ensure that these policies are really grounded in place so that we can avoid some of these troubles in the future. And then our fourth area of focus has been on the unique challenges in Puerto Rico. As we all know, the devastation there was so significant. But there are a number of challenges that are unique to Puerto Rico that we've been focusing on and trying to bring assistance to. One of the most pressing challenges has been the sheer number of informal housing settlements that are on the island. So this is a situation where either people own their home but don't have the paperwork to prove legal title, or they are living on land that is not owned by them. Perhaps it's public land or other private land, often with the acknowledgement and acquiescence of the Puerto Rican government. But because they don't have that underlying legal ownership of the land, they've faced significant barriers getting assistance from FEMA that they really need and deserve. We've also been focusing on some of the unique challenges with families that have been displaced from Puerto Rico to states in the mainland. Right now, there are thousands of households who are living in over 40 states and coordinating their ability to be able to receive housing assistance or longer-term housing needs has been very difficult. Given all of the other issues that are impacting the island. I did want to spend a brief moment to talk about the important role that philanthropy can play and the work that we and others are doing on the ground. You know, one of the things that we were struck by is just how overwhelmed local housing organizations are in dealing with the immediacy of disaster recovery. They have so much work ahead of them, but so little capacity to devote the time and energy that's needed for to really make an impact here. And we all know from past disasters that a long-term sustained commitment and advocacy strategy is one that's most successful in ensuring that low-income people get the resources that they need. And we see the same capacity issues at the federal level as well with national organizations. There's always a lot of interest in the weeks immediately after a disaster from across the board, but of course, without dedicated funding for capacity, the attentions of those organizations is often diverted when new issues crop up and demand their attention. So it's something that we've noticed and that seems to be across the board, both at the local and at the national level. Again, one of the places where your organizations can have the most impact, I think, is in ensuring that there's the capacity to undertake a long-term sustained advocacy strategy to make sure that the recovery is equitable and fair for all households, including those with the greatest needs. And with that, I'll hold off unless people have questions.
Thanks, Sarah. There are a few questions. We'll start with you, Sarah, since you were last to finish up. Can you tell this audience how they might get to some of the work of the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, where they might access information on the organizations that are involved and some of the needs that have surfaced in those interactions?
Absolutely. Any organization can follow up with me directly, but you can also find this information on our website at www.nlihc.org/disaster.
It's really helpful. Thank you. And as a reminder, both the recording of this webinar and a written report with the same information that Sarah's just shared with us verbally will be available on the Simmons Foundation website following this briefing. A second question to you, Sarah, is you mentioned in particular that states outside of the states and the territories that were affected by the hurricane have residents that have evacuated to other states on the mainland. Mm-hmm. Do you have an example of some states that seem to be doing well with receiving and caring for evacuees? We have national funders on these briefings who may be from areas that have received evacuees, and it'd be helpful, I think, for us to know where there may be states with high needs or states that are doing a really good job, if you have that information.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a number of states where Puerto Rican families have been, I'd say, concentrated, or their movement has been concentrated. There's a lot of Puerto Rican families who are now living in Florida, in the Orlando area especially, but also in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. Those are the areas that have the highest numbers of Puerto Rican families. I'll say that it's not to say that states haven't done a good job responding to the needs, but in large part their hands are often tied because their existing resources are already oversubscribed so much. So, for example, there's been some talk about whether or not displaced families could get on waiting lists for housing assistance through their local housing agencies. But we know that the wait list for those housing programs are often several years long. And so none of those are really are adequate to address their immediate housing needs right now. We've been pushing for a solution at the federal level, which is called the Disaster Housing Assistance Program, which is a program that was started after some hard lessons after Katrina, that provides direct rental assistance, but also case management services to help place families in, help them find employment and transportation and other needs. This is something that's been used after several disasters post-Katrina. It had a lot of bipartisan support from both the George Bush and Barack Obama administrations, but that we haven't seen this administration take up. And we've been really disappointed with FEMA's refusal to allow this program to exist. So we're continuing to work on that. That would provide local governments with the resources they need to address the housing needs for Puerto Rican families who have been displaced.
Thanks, Sarah. Katrina, here are a couple questions for you. How do funders access the funder calls that you've mentioned? And be sure to unmute your mic.
Yep, that was it. Thanks, Kim, for the reminder. That is always a good question, and to be frank, one that we struggle with. We are always eager to include more people on funders calls if and as we have them. I can work with Kim to make sure whoever is asking is included on future funders calls.
Is there would they contact you directly, or is there a?
Sure. So we don't. Fair question. We have not been. I know we have so far had one in the past couple of months. We've had one funders call. Our folks, to be perfectly frank, have been a little bit swamped with just doing the initial paperwork and getting everything lined up to have this money ready to go out the door. And right now we're in the process of developing those administrative guidelines for this most recent allocation of almost $28 billion. Moving forward, I think we're expecting to have another funders call in about a month or within, to be honest, probably 6 to 8 weeks from now. And as we get that scheduled, I will work with Kim, actually, and ask her even if we can send out the invitation to everybody who's been invited to this series. I'll say that we have not had as regular of a set of funders calls, in part just because we have been swamped internally and working on all the data collection that lets us present those need numbers to Congress so that they can allocate the funding. But moving forward, we're expecting another call within the next 2 months or so.
Great, thanks. We'll look for that information. Katrina, also in your descriptions of ways in which you saw opportunities for philanthropy to help, you mentioned difficult to reach populations. I know Sarah has described, homeless persons as often difficult to reach and population, and sometimes difficult for them to access services. I suspect, but I'd like to hear from you, that low English proficiency residents or undocumented residents might also be difficult to reach populations. When you use that phrase, do you have specific groups of vulnerable people in mind?
That is a very fair question, which I am not well prepared to speak on. I hesitate to make too strong of a statement, because I'm sure that HUD has an official position on this, and I know that HUD, especially in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, we have a team that has worked to make sure that much of our information gets translated into numerous languages as appropriate for the area. But yes, that is always one of the subsets of people, are those who might not even realize that there might be translated materials into their language. It also may include folks, and please don't quote me on this as the only populations that we have difficulty reaching, but sometimes it may be young parents or single mothers who are busy, to put it mildly, and that's why I mentioned the example of a daycare. Right? There may be, I know I will not do justice to answering this question comprehensively, but I will say that for those of you who are engaged with specific populations and specific vulnerable subsets of populations, I would challenge you to consider, are these folks that have the time, energy, capacity to research or be looking for funding that might be available to them, or do they not?
Thanks.
That's probably not satisfying, and I'm sorry for not being able to give you more concreteness.
That's helpful, but it sometimes points to, I think, the need that we've talked about both in this briefing and in several other briefings of having case managers and wraparound services that can assist families in all types of need. Sarah, one final question, and this may sound like a technical question, but I won't apologize for that. Are there certain targets that areas should have when they think about low-income housing? We know that there are certain places throughout the country where there's chronically low inventory for affordable housing. Are there ways in which philanthropy can begin to think about their own areas of residence, as well as these disaster-impacted communities, with a general rule or a general standard for how much low-income housing should be available in a particular population?
Ooh, that is a really good question. We're so far, part of the hard part in answering us is that we're so far away from addressing the needs of extremely low income people. It's hard to even say what would be what the standard should be. We just it's much easier to say that it's far away from where we are now. So that's why the National Low Income Housing Coalition focuses so much on extremely low income households. These are households who either earn less than the poverty limit or less than 30% of their area median income. And what we've found across the board, in every congressional district, in every state, in every city, in every county, is that those households are the ones who face the greatest shortage of affordable homes. And in part, that's because it's difficult to build housing that deeply affordable without layering many sources of financing and other resources. So we would always advocate that for philanthropy, that their focus should include putting a majority of the resources to people who have the greatest needs in that way.
Thank you. And one final question. Is it best to approach legislators about the Disaster Housing Assistance Program and renewing commitment to that, or do you approach FEMA directly if you want to advocate for that?
Well, we've taken a broad approach. We are speaking with FEMA, but I think they are unwilling to move off of that. We've also spoken with HUD, and to their credit, HUD has been very helpful. I believe they want to set up the DHAP program. They've told us that it's a priority for them, but the real barrier to it is FEMA. And so there are different ways that we can help move FEMA off of its current position. One is advocating with members of Congress, particularly from areas that are either impacted directly by the disaster or who are seeing that influx of families from Puerto Rico who are in need of resources. And the other is to advocate directly with the governors of these states and to encourage them to make a formal push for DHAP, which would get the ball rolling with FEMA as well.
Thanks so much.
Can I follow up on that?
Sure.
Sure. So from the perspective of HUD, I thank you, Sarah, for recognizing our interest in this issue. I will say that I don't, given the historic allocations that Congress has made in the wake of the disasters in 2017, I think I don't know definitively. I don't claim to be able to read the minds of Congress or what they will do, but I don't think we expect additional allocations in the aftermath of those disasters, given how much has been put forward. I know that given the amount of money that has been put forward, there is great opportunity for the state and local governments to consider what their needs are on the ground. And so moving forward for the future disasters or the long-term populations that have difficulty finding permanent housing, DHAP can be seen as one option to help that population. But I think in the shorter term, for those folks who are struggling to find housing, I think there might be a consideration for how different organizations, based on your skill sets and your what you bring to the table, I guess what can you help communities on the ground think of as creative solutions?
Thanks, Katrina. We're going to take the rest of our time for today to turn to funders who may have reports of their own work or questions of others. If you have something to share, please click on the raise your hand icon and I'll announce you and share the microphone with you. Sally Ray, my colleague from Center for Disaster Philanthropy, you have the mic now.
Thank you, Kim. I am hearing a lot of feedback. But anyway, I just wanted to update everyone on what we're doing. We're looking to do our second round of funding, and it should go out the door in July. We're focusing in the areas of housing rebuild and repair, along with immigration legal services, and also mental health and healthcare. We may go a little bit beyond that, but those are the three bucket areas that our committee has indicated that we need to be looking at.
Sally, thanks for that. It sounds as if those programs will maybe address some of the needs that Katrina and Sarah have mentioned in their own comments today. Any other questions or reports for today? If not, then it's time for us to close. We hope that this briefing has informed your work as funders, and please share news of these briefings with other funders who would benefit from the topics that are either already archived on the Simmons Foundation website or that we'll be covering in the next few weeks. Our next briefing is on May the 21st, and it's going to be focusing on environmental risk and disaster recovery with Rachel Leon, the Executive Director of Environmental Grantmakers, and Jackie Patterson, who's the Senior Director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. So again, we'll be back on May the 21st at 2 p.m. We want to share our thanks to Katrina and to Sarah for taking time to be with us today and for helping us expand our knowledge of the needs and resources for folks in low-income brackets of the economy who need our support, and for work that philanthropy can do to support the federal government and housing organizations as they repair and rebuild and make new spaces available for those who were at risk before the storm and continue to be so afterwards. We want to also thank our sponsor, the Simmons Foundation, for their support. And as a final reminder, the written summary and recording of this briefing will be mounted at the Foundation website in their initiative area on Hurricane Harvey. If you have questions that weren't addressed during today's briefing, you may email them to me at kim.maphisearly@disasterphilanthropy.org or to my colleague Sally Ray. And we hope that you'll let other funders know about our briefings and that you yourself will join us again in 2 weeks. Have a good afternoon.